Welcome to the Learn Biology podcast, where we break down complex biological concepts and make them easy to understand. In this episode, we'll be focusing on the different types of chemical bonds that hold molecules together. We'll be discussing covalent bonds, ionic bonds, and hydrogen bonds and how they shape the properties of the molecules. Let's start with ionic bonds. Ionic bonds are formed by the transfer of electrons between atoms. One atom loses an electron, and the other atom gains an electron, creating ions atoms or molecules that have a net charge. The gain or loss of electrons results in ions. Cations are ions that are positively charged, which means they have lost an electron. And ions are ions that are negatively charged, which means they gained a negatively charged electron. A common example of an ionic bond is the bond that forms between sodium and chlorine, creating the compound sodium chloride, which we know as salt. In this example, the sodium is positively charged cation and chloride is the negatively charged anion. Since opposites attract, these two oppositely charged ions are attracted to each other and form an ionic bond. Now that we understand the formation of ionic bonds, let's explore how salt dissolves in water. Water is a polar molecule, which means it has partial positive and negative charges associated with it. When salt is mixed in water, the polar water molecules are attracted to the ions in salt and surround them, effectively breaking up the ionic bond and resulting in the salt dissolving in water. This is due to the polar nature of water molecules and the fact that they can interact with ions in salt. Moving on to covalent bonds, which are formed when atoms share pairs of electrons to achieve a full outermost shell of electrons. Covalent bonds are extremely strong. Covalent bonds can also exist by sharing more than one pair of electrons. For example, two oxygen atoms form two covalent bonds by sharing two pairs of electrons. Other atoms form triple covalent bonds. Another important property of chemistry that influences covalent bonds is electronegativity, which is a measure of an atom's ability to attract electrons in a bond. Elements with high electronegativities, such as oxygen, tend to form polar covalent bonds, while elements with low electronegativities, such as carbon and hydrogen, tend to form nonpolar covalent bonds. The concept of polar and nonpolar molecules relates to how covalent bonds behave when atoms have different electronegativities. A polar molecule is one where the electrons are not shared equally and results in a molecule with a partial charge. A nonpolar molecule is one where the electrons are distributed equally, resulting in a molecule without a partial charge. Water is a polar molecule because it does not share electrons evenly with the hydrogen atoms it forms covalent bonds with. The electrons are pulled more strongly to oxygen, and the result is that oxygen has a partial negative charge and hydrogen having a partial positive charge. Note, the electrons are not actually transferred from oxygen to hydrogen, they just are more closely associated with oxygen. The saying "like dissolves like" refers to the idea that polar substances tend to dissolve in polar solvents and nonpolar substances tend to dissolve in nonpolar solvents. This is related to the polarity of molecules, where polar molecules are attracted to polar solvents and nonpolar molecules are attracted to nonpolar solvents. Another example is that molecules with charges dissolve other molecules with charges. We know this already, since water, which has partial charges, can dissolve salt, which is formed from charged ions. Also, water, which is polar, can dissolve sugar, which is also polar. Lastly, water, which is polar, cannot dissolve oil, which is nonpolar. Molecules that like water are called hydrophilic and molecules that do not like water are called hydrophobic. Another type of bond is the hydrogen bond, which is formed when a hydrogen atom forms a bond with a highly electronegative atom, such as nitrogen or oxygen. Hydrogen bonds are relatively weak compared to covalent and ionic bonds, but they play important roles in the structure of molecules such as proteins and nucleic acids. They can easily be broken by disrupting the interaction between the hydrogen atom and the electronegative atom. A question that is often asked is whether hydrogen bonds are important in DNA and protein structures. The answer is yes. Hydrogen bonds play a crucial role in the stability of both DNA and protein structures. In DNA, hydrogen bonds hold the double helix together, while in proteins, hydrogen bonds are responsible for maintaining the shape and function of the protein. That's all for today's episode of the Learn Biology podcast. I hope you have a better understanding of the different types of chemical bonds and how they shape the properties of the molecules themselves. In our next episode, we'll be discussing how these bonds are important in the structure and function of biological molecules such as DNA and proteins. Thanks for listening to the Learn Biology podcast. Be sure to tune in next time for more fun and informative episodes.